So, as promised, today we're going to continue our discussion of sex and gender. I'm going to start out with talking about feminism a little and kind of creating a map for us of different feminist ideas, because we often talk about feminism like it's one thing, which it really isn't. There's a lot. It's a whole, like, in a lot of ways, it's a whole camp of thought, right? There's a whole lot of different ideas that could be labeled feminism. And then we're going to look at the article, the Kim and Luke article, Men's Economic Dependency, Gender Ideology, and Stress at Midlife. Hoping to get through all that in one day, but we'll see. Okay, so what do you guys know about feminism? Let's start there. What do you guys already know about feminism? What are your perceptions of feminism? Yeah.
Fights for gender equality.
So generally, yeah, feminism is something that fights for gender inequality. What else?
There's different ways of feminism, like there's history.
Yeah, so that's definitely something we're going to dig into, the different waves. The wave structure is confusing because it also identifies different ways of thinking about feminism, a lot of which, the earlier waves are still around, right? But so there's a bit of a confusion there. What else do people know? Do you know what the waves are?
Like first wave, second wave, third wave, and then like some there's like a third wave or a fourth wave that's like happening right now.
Yeah, so generally it's broken up into first wave feminism, second wave feminism, and third wave feminism. So when it comes to feminist ideas, there's sort of three periods where there's a lot of generation of feminist ideas, and then periods in between where there's very little going on. And so that's why this sort of wave structure started, and that's how often feminist theory is talked about. Does anybody else heard of the waves before, or is just one person in here? So out of the two people, do you know when any of the waves happened?
The first wave was kind of like the suffrage movement and kind of pulling getting right to vote. It's kind of getting that first level of being able to work on cooperating and do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then secondly, I'm not sure quite, like the distinctions between the second and the third wave are kind of like a little bit more murky. But I know the third wave kind of hit in the middle of the 20th century. Yeah. When I started to get more like sexual freedom with birth control and things like that, so we work outside the home, being more clear and things like that. And I know that's kind of the distinction. Birth control is kind of the big like marker right now. But yeah.
Actually, first wave is where birth control starts, but
yeah.
we'll look at that. So yeah, first wave. So we're just going to temporalize it. The first wave happens in the 19th and early 20th century. Second wave happens in particularly the 1960s and 70s. And the third wave starts in the 1990s. So, and yeah, like I said, they all kind of developed distinct ideas. All of them in some way or another are still around though. So first wave feminism, generally if we talk about it, is in terms of theory, it's often referred to as liberal feminism. We use this word wrong in the United States. Are people aware of this? Just take it, yeah. And the same thing, I think I brought that up when we talked about neoliberalism, right? Liberal in the traditional meaning of the word is pro-democracy and pro-free market ideas. Anything that falls within that is called liberal. For some reason in the United States we mean it to mean that they belong to the left-leaning side of our political structure. I don't really know why. But, so liberal feminism, right, was mostly concerned with things like the right to vote, the right to own property. I think most people don't realize that women couldn't own property until the 20th century. So women could not own property. In fact, legally speaking, women were property, which is one of the reasons why they couldn't own property. So women did not have the right to own property. What might be a ramification of that? If you can't own property, what might be a downside to not being able to legally own anything?
Well, if you're not married, then you won't have anything, really.
Yeah, if you're not married, you have to be taken care of by somebody, right? So what happens if, like, you're married and your husband dies? What happens to your belongings?
Hopefully you have sons.
Hopefully you have sons. If you don't have sons, what happens to it? It goes to the next closest male heir, right? So it could move completely outside of your control and you could just be sort of like left destitute. That's why actually like having sons is if you read like novels from the 19th century, there's like an obsession with having to have sons. And that's why is because women couldn't own property. So like if they lost, essentially if they lost, their husband passed away, they might very well just end up destitute. So one of the things that became a big deal in liberal feminism, that women should be able to vote, they should be able to own property, and then the third thing is the repeal of the Comstock Law in the United States, at least. It was illegal to talk about contraception in the United States. Doctors could be arrested for bringing it up. And you couldn't talk about it in terms of, and like quite often with lengthy prison sentences, it was illegal to talk about birth control. So a lot of early feminists were fighting, right, to make that legal, to make talking about contraception legal. So, all that makes sense? So when I said that, like to some degree, like pretty much everyone today, for the most part, would be able to self-identify as some brand of feminism. Most of us, a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as feminists, are liberal feminists. Because I doubt that there's very many, probably no one in this room thinks that we should repeal women's right to vote and own property, right? So that's the first wave. The second wave of feminism has a series of different ideas that come up. To some degree, this is the most unified theoretically. So if we're talking about liberal feminist theories, they're going to be interested in a lot of ways. They're going to be interested in a lot of the same issues. Also, and this is worth mentioning, also in liberal feminism is also attempts to remove the idea of female inferiority. In particular, the idea that women were often, not only the idea that women were mentally inferior, but the idea that women were things like prone to madness and stuff like that, essentially became ways of controlling women over time. So that's also a big part of liberal feminism. Okay, second wave. In the 1960s and 70s, the three biggest branches of second wave feminism would be Marxist feminism, radical feminism, and victim feminism. So in terms of thought, those are the three major ones inside of the second wave. Marxist feminist, we're familiar with a lot of the language of Marxist feminism, just culturally. So Marxist feminism, you ever hear people say that women are objectified? You guys hear that term? That grows out of Marxist feminism. So they're interested in the objectification of women. What does that mean? What does the word objectify mean? Do people know this? What do you do when you objectify something?
Basically, like taking your identity away as a human being and only placing your value on them as something that they can give you as a piece of an object. Like, I mean, a lot of people think like sexual objectification, like only seeing a woman as being serving that purpose. Yeah. So it's reducing people down to their body, right? The literal word objectification means turning something into objects, right? And so that's actually a bigger part of Marxist literature, and that's where the term's coming from. So Marx talks a lot about the objectification of human labor. Right? That labor, you know, and this is like some of the stuff we talked about when we were talking about inequality. If you remember us talking about people selling their labor now, that idea is often referred to as objectification. So where before the labor is a part of my subjectivity, it belongs to me, it becomes something objective, right? I sell it as an object. In the same way, Marxist feminists will focus on the way in which women, who are subjects, right, are turned into objects, not treated as being human, right? Another related idea of this is the idea of commodification. So do you guys know what the word commodity means? Anyone ever hear this word before? It's kind of a normal, like, economics word. What is a commodity? Just looking for guesses.
That's something you can buy.
Yeah, it's something that you buy and sell, right? And so, so Marxist feminists will often point to things as well as like that women become commodities, right? Commodification is the process of taking something that's not a commodity and turning it into something that is. More and more of our lives are sort of like taken over by essentially the market, right? So the idea is that a lot of things that used to not be thought of as commodities became them, right? And so historically we can see that, you know, water used to not be a commodity, property used to not be a commodity, you couldn't necessarily buy or sell it, right? So we take things that are not commodities and then we turn them into commodities, things that are bought and sold, right? And the process is called commodification. So Marxist feminists are often very interested in ways in which women become commodities. They become something that's bought and sold, particularly women's bodies, or any time that women's bodies become a part of the market, right? So this could be things like prostitution. This could be things like, a lot of times Marxists claim that throughout history, marriage becomes almost a form of commodification of women. Right, especially when they, you know, don't have much say in that earlier on in history, but even to this day, or even things like, sorry, if I talk too fast, I run out of breath because of the mask. Okay, so yeah, in a variety of different ways, right, women become, right, their thoughts, their ideas, their actions become commodities that are bought and sold. Okay. Another, and this is another major theme in Marxist feminism that you come across as you come across the idea of the devaluation of women's labor. devaluation of women's labor. This is both ideas of, so even to this day, when you go into the workforce, if you are a woman with the exact same credentials, you will make 20% less than a male counterpart. Right? So that's still true to this day. It's very likely, you're also less likely to get promoted, even if you're doing a better job, so people will likely get promoted over you. There's often still to this day perceptions that you don't want to invest in women as a company because they might have kids and leave, right? All of these are forms of devaluation of women's labor. So women are paid less for their actions. Yeah?
Like, when you say like women will make less,
Yeah.
do you think that like maybe women, like, and I don't know, like, are we choosing maybe different career fields or maybe degrees that might cause that statistic to show up that way? Because like, that's obviously like one statistic that has a lot of ripple effects. So like, have you looked into that much?
Yeah. So okay. So actually, in our article comments on this, if we're actually looking at like real income, women are actually starting to make more than men. And that's largely because, and when you look around this room, you can, well, look around this room. Why do you think that is? Anyone want to venture a guess on why women are starting to make more than men?
Well, women are going to college now.
Yeah, women go to college in much higher percentages than men. Despite the fact that in popular discourse we talk about college like it's not going to make you much more money, it really does. So things are starting to even out there. Where you do still get a difference is that if you're a male with the same credentials, working the same job, women will make less, right? So, and that's, I mean, I think that'll probably change in our lifetime, partially because of these demographic shifts, right? But it's still something, that's still something that's still true, right? There's other ways that women's labor is devalued, is that it's often the work that women do is not seen as work. And it's largely because what do we define as work in the United States? At what point does it become work?
You pay for it.
When you get paid for it. Even to this day, more of the work that women do is unpaid. Right? So thinking about whether you're talking about staying at home. Anybody here, parents, anyone here have a stay-at-home mom if you want to venture that? How much work is it for somebody to stay home with their kids? Yeah, being a stay-at-home mom is a little bit like working constantly and never actually like being able to divorce yourself from that. It's a very stressful life in a lot of ways, you know. But nonetheless, we still have this idea, right, that despite the fact that women who stay at home work more, we often don't perceive that as work. And if they're married, right, it's going to be very often that the husband is capable of downplaying the work that his wife does and talking about how he works so hard, right? We've all kind of heard that before, right? And so essentially Marxist feminists are interested in this process that women do phantom labor. They sometimes refer to it as reproductive labor. And the idea of reproductive labor is not just like sexual reproduction, right, having children, but the idea that by and large life is sustained by women worldwide. Meaning that most of the food that people eat is, you know, maintained by women. Homes are maintained by women. You know, women predominantly do the cleaning. Even when, so like today things have gotten more egalitarian, but often like when both a man and a wife work, women actually still do most of the homework, right? The housework, right? And all that is often not seen as happening. So often we treat women's labor like it's invisible, right? And nobody's doing it. It's just things that happen all on their own. Okay, there's one more theme, but I think I'll save it till we get to the article, because our first article grows out of Marxist feminism as well, and we're going to talk about, when we look at it, the idea of separate spheres. and the history of separate spheres. So that's an example of Marxist feminism. Radical feminism is, a lot of our stereotypes about feminism come from radical feminism. And radical feminism is sort of the idea that, there's a few different ideas, so that there's this sort of like separatist idea that like basically that men and women cannot actually get along, so they shouldn't necessarily like live and work together. Like this is a common idea in radical feminism. Particularly this was started by Shulamith Firestone, was a thinker that wrote basically tracts about how we need to change the way that reproduction happens so that men and women weren't thrown into working and living together. Radical feminism is often going to, and this is, there's sort of like attacks. It sounds pretty like, so radical feminism is going to be very interested in, I like that phrasing better, femininity as a form of control. Right? They're going to be interested in the way in which women are controlled through having to be feminine. And they're going to be very interested in the way in which women's bodies, right, particularly like biologically, become a form of control. So this is where you're going to get stuff like women being slaves to reproduction, slaves to their children, like that kind of idea that the family is a site of basically like controlling women through their bodies. All that is radical. Radical feminism is probably the branch of second wave feminism that's died out the most. You don't see a lot of radical feminism anymore. And I think it's partially this focus on bodies and the idea of women sort of naturally being sort of like naturally being oppressed, right? And that always having been the case. I think that's kind of the theme that dies out a lot. Okay, last one is victim feminism. Victim feminism is going to be focused on the way in which women are victimized, right? So the idea that, a good example of this would be the idea of the global war on women. That women in various ways are forced into victimhood. This could be, victim feminism would be concerned with. Does anybody know what the most common violent crime in the United States is? This is just rape. Rape is more likely than any other form of violent crime. Rape is more common than assault, right? What's the least likely violent crime to actually be arrested and prosecuted for? Rape, right? Rape and sexual assault. Most sexual assaults are unreported. The ones that do get reported generally get thrown out. A lot of times they don't get investigated, right? It is literally probably the easiest crime to get away with. And I mean, heck, right now, like, do you guys know what Title IX is? Have you guys ever heard this? Did you guys hear about the changes that happened to Title IX? So Title IX historically has been designed to protect women, right, from being sexually assaulted, sexually harassed, or raped inside of work settings. It's now been transformed that it's more about defending the accused than women. They altered the law this year to make it, right? So like people, victim feminism will point to things like this and be like, there's sort of a global war on women. Women find themselves placed in the position of victimhood a lot. Even to, there's things like even things like in the United States, there's some states where it wasn't until the 1990s that it was illegal to rape your wife. And you still get a lesser sentence for it in most states than if you rape somebody else, right? You think about that idea, right? The victim feminism is going to be very concerned with ideas like that. Can anybody think of an example of current victim feminism as a political movement? There's a recent political movement.
Me Too movement?
The Me Too movement is an example of victim feminism, a contemporary example of victim feminism. In a lot of ways, a lot of political movements for feminism grow out of victim feminism. Okay. Any questions so far on our map of, you guys see how radically different ideas within feminism can be? Right? So like it runs a gamut. Okay, there's one more wave, the third wave. There is always a constant discussion of whether there is or whether we are in a fourth wave, just like there's a constant discussion if there's something past the postmodern, right? And people have been talking about that for 20 years, and no one's really come up with anything. But anyways, wave three is going to focus on very different things. So it's going to focus on women's agency, right? So one of the major themes in third wave feminism is going to be this move away from viewing women as victims, this move away from viewing women as complacent to the system, right, of oppression. Oh, by the way, important term, forgot this, and this is another area of Marxist thought. I didn't put this in my notes. Have you guys ever heard the word patriarchy? Right, what's patriarchy mean?
Basically the system that we're under is made for and ruled by men.
Yeah, and that idea it grows out of Marxist feminism. So the idea of patriarchy is particularly a Marxist concept. Actually, one of the first feminists in Marxist feminism, so this is why the wave structure sometimes doesn't really work very well. Does anybody know who the first Marxist feminist is? Marx. Right? So like there's actually a lot of feministic writing that goes back to Marx and Engels. And that's where initially the idea of patriarchy it really sort of gets theorized. Anyways, so that's just to throw that out. So if you're wondering where that stuff belongs, that's also a branch of Marxist feminism. Okay, getting back to third wave feminism. It's going to be focused on women's agency. It's going to be focused on a positive portrayal. So this third wave feminism and second wave feminism are in contact, particularly conflict with one another, particularly radical feminism. And that's because often third wave feminism is going to focus on have a positive focus on femininity. Right? It's going to look at femininity as not necessarily like something against women, but actually something that women should be and willing to sort of like revel in. That there's positive characteristics to being feminine. And so examples of third wave feminism that fits this is there's a whole movement called girly feminism, right? That had to do with basically purposely constructing a sort of feminine self. And it's this idea of positive femininity that gives third wave feminism probably the thing that it's most famous for, which is it has a very different attitude towards sex. So where previous ideas about sexuality often viewed sex as something harmful against women, third wave feminism usually talks about women, even women using sex in roles like prostitution or women using sex in things like strippers, stuff like that. They often view it very positively, right? This is sort of asserting of women's power in sex, right? And they would promote that. Our article for Friday definitely has some third wave feminist undertones to it, and how it talks about prostitution. And lastly, part of third wave feminism is black feminism and post-colonial feminism. And so that's going to be focused on the ways in which previous branches of feminism are really about white people's experience of feminism, right? It's about white women's experiences to the exclusion of other populations. So that's going to be a major theme in third wave feminism. Post-colonial feminism is focused mostly on, like, other things we've looked at, right? Like how feminism, or how the treatment of women is intertwined with colonialism. They're particularly critical of victim feminism, usually. So both black feminism and post-colonial feminism have a tendency to be somewhat conflicting with victim feminism. And the reason why is often victim feminism paints minorities in a really negative way. So like a lot of victim feminism is focused on things like, you guys ever heard of female genital mutilation? You guys know what this is? Sometimes female circumcision. It's where they remove female sex organs in some cultures. And like, there's a huge feminist literature that grew out of victim feminism about female genital mutilation. Post-colonial feminists are going to basically try to point out the ways in which, and it is true that victim feminism predominantly like to talk about poorer countries, other countries in the world as places where women are specifically poorly treated. You get this stuff, a lot of like hostility towards Muslims in the West, right, are caught up in ideas about victim feminism. Post-colonial feminists will look, things like, they treat things like, wearing the burqa or something like that as something that women are forced into. But even though most women in Muslim countries actually want to wear it, stuff like that. So post-colonial feminism is going to be a little hostile towards victim feminism. They're critiques of victim feminism. Okay, all that makes sense? Were people aware of quite a bit of this stuff, or is this all kind of new? No response. Okay, so yeah, so this is a short map of feminist thought. Like I said, most stuff on gender is going to grow out of feminism, and you can see a lot of gender in here already, right? The idea that patriarchy is a system, right? That's a gender system, right? Okay, let's go ahead and talk about our article now. So we already were starting to nod at this. So how's the gender landscape for income changing?
We're starting to make more.
Yeah, a third of households now have the primary, or at least the person who makes the most money are women, right? This is a big shift, right? So, what's the article interested in within this shift? What does it think it might be happening? Yeah.
It's affecting like the men, like men's health, basically, like throughout their life.
Yeah, so it's looking at men's health, particularly health related to what? What would be the expectation of how men would react to women their wife making more money than them, or somebody that they're coupled with? Who's supposed to make money in a family traditionally? Yeah, we live a long history of sort of men breadwinning culture, right? I told you we were going to get to separate spheres. So does anybody know the history of men and of the idea of work? Where did it, we kind of nodded at this when we were talking about inequality too. Where did people used to work? Before the 19th century, where did people work? Where was most work done? Oh, so you might farm. When people farmed, what land did they farm? Their own. What else is where they farm? What else is on their farm?
House.
Their home, right? The sort of like individual, like small family farm was a house, right? And farm fields. Okay, let's say rather than farming, you make something, linen weaver, right? Blacksmith, wherever. Where do you usually work out of? Your home, right? If you are instead somebody who's wealthy and primarily engages in business, where do you conduct business out of? I heard somebody say something quietly off in this direction.
Your home.
Yeah. You guys think about like you watch like I don't know like BBC productions on PBS, right? Like all those shows like I don't know like Downton Abbey or something, right? That's what the manor was, right? That's where people conducted their business out of, right? They conducted it in a very social setting. So, how removed are women from work life prior to the 19th century? They're not. There's a gender division of labor. Men and women don't do the same work, but they do work in the same location, right? They are intertwined with one another, and the idea of women staying home and men going to work is not a concept, right? Instead, what it is that both people work, but they do different tasks, and they do them in the same place at home. Even like when it comes to working for pay, like it's not very uncommon for women to work for pay, especially once you get out of the upper classes. And in reality, and this was actually kind of a critique of black feminism, of other forms of feminism, it never really becomes popular for most of the population. Most of the population, women have to work. Poor whites, African Americans, all these had both men and women usually working. What sort of work did women primarily do after work separated out, if you guys were to take a guess? What kind of work would women do?
Around the home.
What's that?
Around the home, like whatever really needs to be done.
So prior to the development of, and this is the language that gets used, the development of separate spheres, with work and home, right, being different spheres, right? Prior to that, yeah, women would if they worked for pay, would work out of the home. After that, what kind of work do you think women would do in comparison to men? So, where do people work at starting in the 19th century when we develop these separate spheres? Where do people start to work? There's something let's start with like the working class. What do most of the people who were farmers end up doing later? What's the transition here?
Is it like factories?
Yeah, they start to work in factories, right? And so you'll see at the working class level this movement, right? Where before they worked out of the home, now they're off going someplace to work, right? It's in this period that we get the creation really of things like offices, right? The idea that you would go and go to your office to work develops in this period, right? Women that do work generally do home care of some sort, right? So most African American women raised white people's kids, right? That's essentially what they would do for money. Most of them had to work, but most of the time they were spent, right? So the ideal becomes a woman staying at home, preferably, if you can afford it, not actually even working in the home, right? So literally sort of keeping women as a stationary, like they live at home and they don't really have anything that they're supposed to or have to be doing. That would be the like ideal in the 19th century. And from there, the next tier down ideal is that women stay at home and raise children and men go to work. And this is where we get that idea from, right? This idea that we now think of that as traditional, but that actually didn't happen until the 19th century. It really hits its peak, and our author points this out on page 1028. It actually, like, the idea of women staying at home and men working hits its peak in the mid-20th century, so in like the 1950s. Because at that point we have a larger number of people who can actually afford to have single income homes. What you've definitely seen is swing away from, with living standards having dropped since the 1950s, that most people cannot live off of an individual income, which I think also is part of the reason you see women entering into the workforce at a lot higher rates. So yeah, this idea is referred to as the separate spheres. And the idea is that they become gendered, right? Spheres become gendered. Home becomes feminine, work becomes masculine. Where before, the divide between home and work just doesn't really exist. So our author is wanting to claim that because this still is this still an idea that people have? Even though it's, practices have changed, do we still put pressure on men to be breadwinners? Yeah, we do. We put pressure on men that there's something unmasculine to essentially being taken care of, right? And even to, like, some people very much so find it unnatural. Does anybody here know of anyone who's a stay-at-home father? Yeah, it's becoming a lot more common. But even to this day, like, people will talk about stay-at-home fathers in a fairly disparaging way, right? Like, as if they're not really working. Which, once again, taking care of children is a massive undertaking. But nonetheless, like, so we still have these sort of gendered tropes. So what our author is interested in is basically how is it affecting men now that a third of them are secondary income people, right? And in particular, it's looking at stress levels, right, with men. They didn't catch what they found. What did they find out? What's the conclusion of the article?
Well, didn't you say that there wasn't really like a direct correlation, because it wasn't clear enough that you could really make a correlation unless you knew like the deeper like goings on or other factors in that.
Yeah, they find absolutely no evidence that dependent men have higher stress levels. Actually, if you go to the chart, so there's two different charts because there's two different samples. They actually look almost identical. But the first one's on page 1032. So you guys go to page 1032. So the thing at the top, they're models to measure the stress, right? And then the side is the other variables. And economic dependency is the first one under men's characteristics. You guys see where I'm at? What do you notice about the relationship, particularly in the second model? I talked about finding stars. You guys remember what stars meant? Remember that time we looked at a statistical chart? Yeah, there's a correlation, there's a relationship between the two things. Is there a star between economic dependency and stress on the second model? There is, right? So if you go over to right here, you guys see where there's a star. But what else do you notice about that number? It's negative. What does that mean? A negative correlation means they go the opposite way from each other.
Reduces stress.
What's that?
It reduces stress.
Yeah, actually, so there is a correlation. The correlation is if you're not the primary breadwinner, you're under less stress. So men are actually less stressed out if women are the primary caretakers, right? But it flips. So if you go down from there you go down to, right? Do you guys see where this says economic dependency right, cross gender ideology. So there's questions on here about basically their attitudes about men's roles, right? And what they find is that if people have very traditional values about who should be bringing in money, right, who should be taking care of kids, and who should be doing the housework, right, then what happens to that number? What's that? How's that number different than the? It's positive. So basically, like, if men hold on to these values, then they are more stressed out if they're not the primary breadwinner. If they don't hold on to those values, then they're actually less stressed. I think that's really interesting, right? So basically, it's very different, and our author is going to explain that with the idea of multiple masculinities. I'll pick up there when we get back on Friday. I also want to say, if anyone is confused about why they received the midterm grade that they did, please let me know. I think I pointed this, I sent you guys an email, right, where I said most of our points are still out there. So even if you have an F in the class, you might still be able to get away with a B or an A. So like, definitely pursue it, figure out why. Most of you, if you have a low grade, it's because I'm missing assignments from you. But you can also make up for partial credit.
So the midterm grade, there wasn't an actual midterm, it's just like a grade, like a alternate grade 6 part.
Yeah, and that's actually when you see your midterm grade, it's not what you perform on a midterm, it's what you're at.